One of the oldest arguments used to try and justify abortion is the viability argument. In a nutshell, this argument wants us to accept the idea that the point of viability, that is, the point at which an unborn human being can live independently of its mother's body, is somehow such a significant milestone that it can be used to determine what rights and protections an unborn human being should be given. It doesn't matter whether someone believes that viability makes you a human being, or whether they believe that you are always a human being, but viability simply means that you are now entitled to extra protections that you weren't entitled to before you were viable. This argument is still completely arbitrary and riddled with major flaws. Firstly, viability is not a fixed point. It is a constantly shifting goalpost. For example, 200 years ago, viability was not even guaranteed at birth. A lot of children died during or close to the time of their birth back then. But thanks to advances in medical science and technology, we have now been able to save babies born as young as 21 weeks premature. Such an outcome was pure fantasy 200 years ago, but today it is a firm reality. And therein lies the problem, because if we believe that the viability argument is true, then we would have to accept the bizarre idea that 21-week-old human beings conceived 200 years ago were somehow not entitled to the same protections or rights as 21-week-old human beings conceived today are, simply because technology has now dramatically shifted the point of viability forward. And this technological shift is about to take an even greater leap forward due to advances in ectogenesis that now have us on the cusp of creating artificial wombs capable of nurturing human beings before 21 weeks gestation. To suggest that your fundamental human rights or your very humanity is determined by whether or not you are dependent on something outside of yourself is absurd. Your fundamental human rights are yours by virtue of your nature, not outside agents that can save your life. So, if you are a human being, you have human rights, and those human rights are supposed to be respected regardless of how dependent you happen to be on something outside of yourself for your continued survival. And viability isn't just arbitrary to the historical period in which you happen to be conceived. It is also arbitrary depending on your geography or possibly even your financial status. For example, a 28-week-old unborn human being has a good fighting chance of survival if they are born premature in a country that has well-funded, well-resourced and well-trained medical staff and hospitals, or if their parents are affluent enough to afford access to such things. But if that same child was to be born premature in a country or a family situation where access to life-saving knowledge and technology was not possible, then suddenly that child loses their viability. And according to the viability argument, because of such arbitrary factors, they weren't a human being or they aren't entitled to the same rights and protections anymore. Again, this is simply not logically sound. But there's another glaring flaw in the viability argument, and that is the fact that it doesn't just apply to unborn human beings. In a nutshell, what the viability argument is trying to claim is that if an unborn human being is dependent on an outside agent for their continued existence, then they aren't fully human or they aren't entitled to the same fundamental rights and protections as other human beings are. But if this is true for human beings inside a womb, why would it not also be true for human beings outside a womb who also depend on an outside agent for their continued existence? Diabetics, for example, are not viable unless they have access to the outside agent of insulin. Infants are also not independently viable because they cannot clothe, feed, hydrate, shelter, or care for themselves. They depend totally on the body of another human being to remain alive. In fact, when it comes down to it, not a single human being is truly independently viable. We all rely on an outside agent for our continued existence. That outside agent is kind of womb-like, and it is kind of amniotic, in that it nurtures us, it protects us from danger, and it provides vital nutrients essential to our health and well-being. That outside agent that we all depend on for our viability is the atmosphere of this planet, and if it was stripped away from us, we would be dead in seconds. You see, the ultimate flaw in the viability argument is this. Your dependency on something outside of yourself for your continued survival has no bearing whatsoever on what you actually are and what rights and protections you should be entitled to. A dependent human being is still a human being. It is our humanity, not our lack of dependence on another person, that entitles us to our fundamental rights and protections. And this is true whether we are 19 years old and about to leave home, or 19 weeks old and still living in our mother's womb. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a tip in the tip jar by using the PayPal link found in the description below.